The rain came down in sheets that evening as Hank Wright locked up his small auto repair shop on the edge of town. At 38, the lines around his eyes told stories of both laughter and hardship. His weathered hands, permanently stained with engine grease despite his best scrubbing efforts, worked the old lock that always stuck in damp weather. Just one more turn, he muttered to himself, giving the key an extra twist. The metallic click finally sounded, a small victory at the end of a long day. As he turned to leave, a movement caught his eye. Someone huddled against the wall of his garage, seeking shelter from the downpour beneath the small overhang. Hank squinted through the rain. It was a teenage girl soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her face. "Hey there," he called out, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "You okay?" The girl looked up and Hank noticed her expensive-looking jacket and shoes, despite their current drenched state. Her eyes held a mixture of wariness and relief at being addressed. "I missed the last bus," she said, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "My phone died and I don't know anyone in this part of town." Hank nodded, understanding the predicament. He glanced at his watch, nearly 10 p.m. No more buses would run tonight, and the nearest hotel was 5 miles away. "I'm Olivia," the girl offered. "Standing up straighter now." "Hank Wright," he replied, extending his hand before awkwardly pulling it back, remembering the grease stains. "Sorry about that." Thunder rumbled overhead, making the decision for him. He couldn't leave a kid out in this weather. "Listen, I've got a 14-year-old son at home. Our apartment isn't much, but you're welcome to crash on our couch tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out how to get you where you need to go." The girl, Olivia, hesitated, clearly weighing stranger danger against the reality of being stranded in a storm. "I should probably call the sheriff first," Hank added quickly, "just so everything's above board. Make sure nobody's looking for you." This seemed to ease her mind, and she nodded. Hank made the call from his old flip phone, explaining the situation to Sheriff Miller, who knew Hank well enough to understand he was just trying to help. "No reports of any missing girls," the sheriff confirmed. "But you bring her by the station first thing tomorrow, you hear? Her folks are probably worried sick." The drive to Hank's apartment was quiet, with only the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers filling the silence. His old pickup truck smelled of motor oil and the peppermint candies he kept in the console. "It's not much," Hank warned as they climbed the stairs to the second-floor apartment. "Been meaning to fix it up but never seemed to find the time." When he opened the door, his son Pete was at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out, a half-eaten sandwich beside him. The boy looked up, surprise evident on his face that mirrored Hank's own features. "Dad? Who's this?" Pete asked, his homework forgotten. "This is Olivia. She missed her bus and got caught in the storm. She's going to stay on our couch tonight." Pete nodded, taking this information in stride the way kids sometimes do. "Cool. Does she want the other half of my sandwich?" "It's turkey." Hank couldn't help but smile at his son's easy hospitality, something he hoped he'd instilled in the boy despite their challenging circumstances. Since Pete's mother had left 4 years ago, it had been just the two of them against the world. "I'm actually starving," Olivia admitted, her shoulders relaxing slightly in the warm apartment. The place was modest at best. Mismatched furniture, walls that needed fresh paint, and a kitchen with appliances from at least 2 decades ago. But it was clean, and the photos on the walls showed a father and son who smiled often despite their circumstances. Hank heated up leftover chili while Pete cleared his homework from the table, chatting with Olivia about school and asking where she was from. She answered vaguely, saying she lived on the other side of town, which Hank recognized as the wealthy area. That explained the expensive clothes. As they ate, Hank noticed how Olivia studied their small home, not with judgment but with curiosity. Her eyes lingered on the wall calendar marked with Pete's basketball games, all circled in red, the stack of library books on the side table, and the jar labeled Future Car Fund that held a sad collection of dollar bills and change. "So what brought you to this neighborhood?" Hank asked casually, not wanting to pry but needing to understand her situation better. Olivia pushed her chili around in her bowl. "I had an argument with my dad. I just started walking. Didn't realize how far I'd gone until it started raining and got dark." Hank nodded, recognizing teen rebellion when he saw it. "Parents and kids don't always see eye to eye," he said carefully. "But they worry. You should call him in the morning. Let him know you're safe." "He probably hasn't even noticed I'm gone," she muttered, but Hank detected a flicker of doubt in her voice. After dinner, Pete loaned Olivia a clean t-shirt and sweatpants to sleep in. They were comically large on her slender frame, but dry. Hank found their only extra blanket, a faded blue throw with baseball patterns that Pete had loved as a child, and made up the couch as comfortably as possible. Bathrooms down the hall. We're early risers around here, but sleep as long as you need, Hank told her, placing a clean towel and a new toothbrush still in its package on the coffee table. Pete and I will try to be quiet in the morning. Thank you, Olivia said, sitting on the edge of the couch. Most people wouldn't do this for a stranger. Hank shrugged, a bit embarrassed by the gratitude. Just doing what anyone should do. But as he turned out the lights and headed to his own room, Hank had no idea that their unexpected guest wasn't just any teenager. Olivia Blackwell was the only daughter of Robert Blackwell, whose real estate empire stretched across 3 states. The argument she'd had with her father had been about his plan to demolish a neighborhood of underperforming properties to build luxury condominiums, a neighborhood that included the very garage where Hank worked 6 days a week to keep a roof over their heads. In the darkness of the Wrights' living room, Olivia stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this humble home, so different from her family's echoing mansion. For the first time in years, despite being on a lumpy couch in a stranger's apartment, she felt something like peace. She had no way of knowing that by morning, her father would have mobilized resources typically reserved for corporate takeovers to find his missing daughter, or that the kindness of the man who had taken her in would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. The smell of coffee and toast woke Olivia the next morning. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting the silk sheets of her bedroom and the distant sounds of their housekeeper preparing breakfast. Instead, she found herself wrapped in a faded baseball blanket on a worn couch, sunlight streaming through blinds that didn't quite close all the way. "Morning," called a cheerful voice. Pete stood in the small kitchen area, carefully flipping pancakes on a battered electric griddle. "Dad had to open the garage early, but he left coffee and said to tell you there's hot water for a shower if you want one." Olivia sat up, pushing hair from her face. "You're making breakfast?" Pete shrugged as if it were perfectly normal for a 14-year-old to be cooking. "Tuesdays and Thursdays are my days. Dad does Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Weekends we take turns." He expertly flipped another pancake onto a growing stack. "Hope you like blueberry. Dad snagged them on sale last week." The domesticity of it all struck Olivia. At home, she rarely saw her father at breakfast. He was usually already locked in his home office on conference calls to the East Coast. Here, father and son had worked out a system, sharing responsibilities. "Need any help?" she offered, folding the blanket. "You could set the table if you want. Plates are up there." Pete pointed with his spatula to a cabinet above the sink. As they ate breakfast together, Olivia found herself relaxing in Pete's easy company. He chatted about school, about the science project he was working on, about how his dad had taught himself to fix almost anything through YouTube videos after they couldn't afford a plumber last year. "Your dad seems really nice," Olivia said, savoring the surprisingly delicious pancakes. "He works too hard," Pete said with the insight of someone older than his years. "But yeah, he's the best. After Mom left, he had to figure out everything on his own. He never misses my games, though, even when I know he's dead tired." Olivia thought about her own father, who had missed her piano recital last month because of a critical investor meeting, but had sent his assistant with flowers. The contrast was striking. After breakfast, she borrowed Pete's phone to call home, bracing herself for her father's anger. To her surprise, the call went straight to voicemail. She left a message saying she was safe and would be home soon, feeling a twinge of disappointment at not having to face the confrontation yet. "I should probably head home," she told Pete, handing back his phone. "Thanks for breakfast. Dad said to tell you he can give you a ride when he comes home for lunch around noon. Or I can show you where the bus stop is." Olivia glanced at the clock, only 9:30. "I can wait," she decided, not quite ready to return to her life. She helped Pete with the dishes, finding the simple task oddly satisfying. Afterward, he showed her his science project, a working model of a wind turbine that he hoped might win the upcoming fair. "Dad helped with the wiring," he explained proudly. "If I win, there's a $500 scholarship for college." "You're already thinking about college?" Olivia asked, impressed. Pete gave her a look that suggested the question was naive. "Have to. Dad started a savings account when I was born, but he trailed off. Well, things happen. I'll need scholarships. Olivia thought about her own college fund, which her father regularly reminded her would cover any school in the world. The weight of that privilege suddenly felt heavy on her shoulders. Around 11:30, they heard heavy footsteps on the stairs outside, followed by the jingle of keys in the lock. Hank entered, his work shirt stained with fresh grease marks, a smudge on his cheek. "Hey, you're still here?" he said, seeming pleased to see Olivia. "Get enough sleep? Pete feed you?" "The pancakes were amazing," she assured him. "Thank you again for letting me stay." Hank waved off her thanks, heading to the sink to scrub his hands. "Just doing what anybody would." "You reach your folks?" "Left a message," Olivia said, suddenly feeling guilty about not trying harder. "I should probably get home." "I'll drive you after I grab a sandwich," Hank offered. "Just need to eat something quick and get back to work. Got a transmission rebuild I need to finish today." As he made a simple sandwich, Olivia noticed how methodically he worked, never wasting a motion. This was a man who had learned to be efficient with everything: time, food, money. Just as they were about to leave, the apartment building seemed to vibrate with the sound of car doors slamming. Through the window, Olivia saw 3 black SUVs parked haphazardly in the small lot. Her stomach dropped. "Oh no," she whispered. Before Hank could ask what was wrong, there was a pounding at the door that made the hinges rattle. Pete looked at his father, alarmed. Hank opened the door to find a tall man in an expensive suit, flanked by 2 stern-looking men, who were clearly security. The tall man's face was flushed with anger, his eyes cold as they fixed on Olivia. "What the hell is going on here?" Robert Blackwell demanded, his voice filling the small apartment. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through, young lady?" Hank stepped instinctively between the angry man and the teenager.
Hold on now.
"Who are you?" "I'm her father," Robert snapped. "And you're the man who took my daughter without permission." Hank's face hardened. "Nobody took anybody. Your daughter was stranded in a storm. I called the sheriff before bringing her here, and she was going to call you this morning." "She did call," Pete piped up, still holding his phone. "She left a message saying she was okay." Robert Blackwell wasn't listening. He turned to one of his men. "Call the police. I want this man arrested for kidnapping." "Dad, stop," Olivia shouted, finally finding her voice. "He helped me. I ran away, remember? We had a fight about the development project, and I just walked out. These people were kind enough to give me a place to stay instead of leaving me out in the rain." Robert's eyes narrowed as he took in the small apartment. The mismatched furniture, the cracked tile in the kitchen, the water stain on the ceiling. His lip curled slightly. "And I suppose that kindness comes with a price tag," he said coldly, reaching for his wallet. "How much do you want?" 5,000, 10? Hank's face flushed deep red. "Put your money away," he said, his voice low and controlled despite his obvious anger. "I didn't help your daughter for money." Pete stood straighter, watching his father with clear admiration. Olivia felt shame burning in her chest at her father's behavior. "Dad," she pleaded, "they made me breakfast. They gave me dry clothes. Mr. Wright was going to drive me home himself. They didn't do anything wrong." Something in her voice must have reached Robert because he paused, looking around the apartment again, this time noticing the neat stack of library books, the carefully mended curtains, the framed photo of Pete in his basketball uniform with his father's arm around him, both beaming with pride. "Fine," he said, finally putting his wallet away. "Let's go, Olivia. Now." "I'm sorry," she whispered to Hank and Pete as she gathered her still damp clothes from the day before. "Thank you for everything," Hank nodded, his expression softening when he looked at her. "You're welcome in our home anytime," he said, loud enough for Robert to hear. As Olivia followed her father down the stairs to the waiting SUVs, she could feel the gulf between her 2 worlds widening with each step. Behind her was warmth, connection, and genuine kindness. Ahead was privilege, power, and her father's controlling presence. Inside the vehicle, Robert started lecturing her immediately about responsibility and her future role in the company. Olivia barely heard him, thinking instead about Pete making pancakes, and Hank refusing the offered money with such dignity. What she didn't know yet was that her father had already discovered exactly who Hank Wright was, a mechanic, working at a garage in one of the neighborhoods Robert planned to demolish. And what Hank didn't know was that the encounter in his humble apartment had set wheels in motion, that would soon change both families forever. The ride home was tense, with Olivia staring out the window as buildings grew larger and more elegant the closer they got to the wealthy part of town. Robert's lecture about responsibility had fizzled out when she'd refused to engage, leaving an uncomfortable silence broken only by the occasional ping of his phone. "You could have been hurt," he finally said, his voice softer than before. "There are dangerous people out there, Olivia." "Like Hank Wright?" she asked, turning to face him. "The mechanic who gave up his couch and made sure I had breakfast?" Robert's jaw tightened. "You know nothing about that man. I know he works hard to take care of his son. I know he refused your money when you tried to pay him off like he'd done something wrong." The SUV pulled through the ornate gates that marked the entrance to their estate, crunching along the perfectly maintained gravel driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows gleaming in the midday sun. To Olivia, it suddenly looked cold and imposing rather than impressive. "We'll discuss this later," Robert said as the driver opened his door. "I have calls to make." Of course he did. He always had calls to make. Inside, their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, fussed over Olivia, insisting she eat something despite her protests that she'd already had breakfast. "Your father was very worried," Mrs. Chen confided as she placed a bowl of homemade soup in front of her. "He had security searching all night." This revelation surprised Olivia. Her father hadn't mentioned being worried, only angry. Later that evening, Olivia sat in her large bedroom, surrounded by every comfort money could buy, yet feeling strangely hollow. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the Wrights' apartment, how the space had felt lived in and warm despite its shabbiness. There was a knock at her door, and her father entered without waiting for a response. He'd changed from his business suit into casual clothes, though casual for Robert Blackwell still meant a designer button-down and tailored pants. "We need to talk about yesterday," he said, taking a seat in her reading chair. "What you did was dangerous and irresponsible." Olivia braced herself for another lecture but was surprised when he continued. "And I handled the situation badly this morning. I shouldn't have accused that man, Hank, without understanding what happened." It was as close to an apology as Robert Blackwell ever came. "You were going to have him arrested," Olivia reminded him. "For helping me." Robert had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "I was worried. When a father thinks his daughter is in danger, he doesn't always think clearly." There was something in his voice, a hint of vulnerability that Olivia rarely heard, that made her anger fade slightly. "Tell me about the argument," he said. "Before you left." Olivia took a deep breath. "It was about the Riverside development. You talked about clearing out the deadwood to make way for progress." "Those aren't deadwood, Dad. They're people's homes and businesses." Robert's expression hardened. "It's a business decision, Olivia. Those properties are underperforming. The owners will be compensated. Compensated doesn't mean they can afford to relocate in this market. Hank's garage is in that neighborhood, isn't it? That's why you looked like you recognized his name this morning." Robert's silence confirmed her suspicion. "You can't just bulldoze people's lives because it makes financial sense on a spreadsheet," she continued, surprising herself with her boldness. "That's exactly what business is," Robert countered, though there was less conviction in his voice than usual. "Making hard decisions based on data. And what does the data say about a single dad raising a teenage son and making pancakes together before school?" Robert stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." But the next day brought no further discussion. Robert retreated into his work and Olivia returned to school, though she found it hard to focus on trigonometry and history when her mind kept wandering back to the Wrights. A week passed, then two. The tension in the Blackwell house eased somewhat, returning to their normal routine of parallel lives. Robert absorbed in his empire building, Olivia in her studies and extracurriculars. But something had shifted in Olivia. She found herself questioning the excess around her in a way she never had before. One evening, while her father was working late in his home office, Olivia slipped in with a cup of coffee, a peace offering. "Thanks," he said, surprised by the gesture. His desk was covered with blueprints and documents, his computer screen displaying a complex spreadsheet. Olivia peered at the papers. "Is that the Riverside project?" Robert nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Phase 1 demolition is scheduled to begin next month. including Hank's garage. Robert sighed. Olivia, can I see the business plan? She interrupted, pulling up a chair before he could object. You always say I should learn more about the company I'll inherit someday. Caught by his own words, Robert hesitantly turned his laptop toward her. These are the financial projections for the next 5 years. Olivia studied the numbers carefully. So the profit margin is projected at 22% overall? That's right, Robert said, a hint of pride in his voice at her quick understanding. Well above industry standard. What if it was 20%? She asked. Or even 18%? Robert frowned. Why would we aim lower? What if instead of demolishing the entire area, you renovated some of the existing businesses? Help them become more profitable rather than replacing them? That's not what we do, Robert said dismissively. We're developers, not charity workers. It's not charity to invest in viable businesses, Olivia countered. Hank's garage, for instance. He's clearly skilled. He was rebuilding a transmission when we left. What if instead of kicking him out, you modernized his shop, made it part of the new development? Robert leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with new eyes. Since when are you so interested in business strategy? Since I saw how the other half lives, she replied honestly. Pete, Hank's son, is saving up for college through science fair scholarships, Dad. He's 14 and already worried about how he'll afford an education. Meanwhile, I have a college fund that could put 10 kids through Harvard. And that's my fault? That I've been successful? Robert's voice had a defensive edge. No, it's nobody's fault. It's just, there has to be a middle ground between tearing everything down and doing nothing. A way for the development to lift people up instead of pushing them out. Robert was silent for a long moment, looking at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. You've really thought about this, haven't you? I have, she admitted. I can't stop thinking about it, actually. He turned back to his computer, pulling up a different file. The garage property is actually owned by a man named Lloyd Thompson. He's retiring to Florida and already agreed to sell. Wright is just a tenant with a month-to-month lease. Olivia felt her heart sink. So he doesn't even know yet? That he's about to lose his business? Notices go out next week, Robert confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. Olivia stood up, suddenly angry again. That's his livelihood, Dad, his and Pete's future. It's business, Olivia. Not personal. It's very personal to them. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. You know what Pete told me? That his dad never misses one of his basketball games, no matter how tired he is. When was the last time you came to one of my piano recitals? The question hung in the air between them, unanswered as she walked away. 3 days later, Olivia was surprised when Robert called her into his office again. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes suggesting several sleepless nights. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, gesturing for her to sit, about finding a middle ground. He pulled out a new set of blueprints and spread them across his desk. This is a revised plan for Phase 1. Instead of complete demolition, we're looking at preserving some of the existing structures, including this one. He pointed to a building that Olivia recognized as Hank's garage. Really? She asked, hardly daring to believe it. The numbers still work, Robert said, though his tone suggested it had taken considerable effort to make them work. We'll modernize the facades, upgrade the infrastructure, but keep some of the local businesses intact. It actually gives the development more character, which we can market as a feature. Olivia studied the plans, noting how the garage had been incorporated into the overall design, even expanded slightly. There's something else, Robert said, pulling out a folder. I had our team research Wright. He's good, really good, actually. Self-taught but certified in everything from basic repairs to hybrid technology. He has a loyal customer base despite working in an outdated facility. So he gets to keep his job? Olivia asked hopefully. Better, Robert replied. Thompson agreed to sell the garage directly to Wright instead of to us, with financing through a small business program our foundation runs. He'll own it outright in 10 years. Olivia stared at her father in disbelief. You're giving him the garage? Not giving, Robert corrected quickly. It's a business arrangement. He'll pay a fair price, just with favorable terms. And in exchange, his shop becomes the official service center for all company vehicles in this region. It's good business for both sides, but Olivia could see, through the business justification to the gesture, beneath it, her father's way of making amends without having to say the words. When are you going to tell him? She asked. Robert shuffled some papers on his desk. I thought maybe we could tell him together. The sun beat down on Hank's neck as he leaned under the hood of Mrs. Grimes's ancient Buick. The air conditioning had given out again, and with summer temperatures climbing, the repair couldn't wait. Sweat dripped onto the engine block as he tightened a connection, hoping this fix would last longer than the previous one. Got any cold water left in that cooler? He called to Pete, who was sweeping the garage floor during his after-school hours. Pete brought over a bottle, condensation running down its sides. Last one, Dad. Want me to run to the corner store for more? Hank straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before accepting the water. Nah, this'll do for now. He took a long drink, surveying the garage that had been his workplace for the past 7 years. The place wasn't much to look at. Concrete floors stained with decades of oil, walls that hadn't seen fresh paint since the 90s, equipment that was functional but outdated. But it was where he'd rebuilt his life after his wife left, where he'd raised Pete to understand the value of hard work. As if reading his thoughts, Pete asked, "Did you hear anything about those rumors? About the development?" Hank's stomach tightened. For weeks, whispers had been circulating about a big company buying up properties in the neighborhood. Nothing official had crossed his desk, but he'd seen it happen before in other parts of town. Small businesses pushed out to make way for high-rise apartments and fancy boutiques. Nothing yet, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Mr. Thompson hasn't mentioned selling. Lloyd Thompson, his landlord, was well into his 70s and had been talking about retiring to Florida for years. The garage had been in the Thompson family for generations, but Lloyd's children had no interest in keeping it. Hank had always hoped to buy the place someday, but his savings fell woefully short of what the property was worth. The rumble of expensive engines interrupted his thoughts. 3 vehicles pulled into the small parking lot, 2 sleek black SUVs flanking a luxury sedan that probably cost more than Hank would earn in 5 years. "We're about to close," Hank said as men in suits emerged from the vehicles. "If you need a repair, we open at 8 tomorrow." But the suits weren't there for a repair. From the center car stepped a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a commanding presence that instantly filled the space. Hank recognized him immediately. Robert Blackwell, the man who had stormed into his apartment a month ago, ready to have him arrested. And behind Blackwell, looking nervous but determined, was Olivia. Hank wiped his hands again, suddenly conscious of his grease-stained coveralls and sweat-soaked t-shirt. "Mr. Blackwell, this is unexpected." "Mr. Wright." Blackwell nodded, his expression unreadable. "I was hoping we could talk." Pete moved to stand beside his father, shoulders squared as if ready to defend him if needed. Hank placed a reassuring hand on his son's back. "About what?" Hank asked directly. Blackwell glanced around the garage, taking in the worn tools and patched equipment. "About the future of this establishment." So it was true. The development rumors were about Blackwell's company. Hank felt a cold weight settle in his chest despite the summer heat. "Dad," Olivia said, stepping forward.
"Maybe we should sit down somewhere."
There was nowhere to sit down in the garage except the small office in the back, barely big enough for Hank's desk and filing cabinet. But the message was clear. This wasn't a conversation to have standing in the workspace. "Pete, finish up with Mrs. Grimes's car, will you? The connection just needs tightening," Hank said, handing his son the wrench. To the Blackwells, he added, "We can talk in my office." The office was stifling, the ancient window unit fighting a losing battle against the heat. Hank offered Olivia the only extra chair while Blackwell remained standing, too tall to comfortably fit under the low ceiling. "I'll get right to the point," Blackwell began. "My company, Blackwell Development, has acquired several properties in this neighborhood for a new mixed-use project." Hank nodded, steeling himself. "And Thompson sold to you?" "He has agreed to sell, yes," Blackwell confirmed. "The paperwork is being finalized." Hank had expected this, but the confirmation still hit hard. This garage wasn't just his workplace. It was the foundation of everything he'd built for himself and Pete. Without it, they'd be starting over from scratch. "I see," he said, his voice carefully even. "How long do I have before I need to clear out?" Olivia exchanged a glance with her father. There was something in their shared look that Hank couldn't decipher. "That's what I wanted to discuss," Blackwell said, reaching into his suit jacket to pull out a folder. "We've made some adjustments to our original development plan. The new design incorporates several existing businesses, including this garage." Hank blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're not demolishing the place?" "No," Blackwell said, opening the folder to reveal architectural drawings. "In fact, we're proposing an expansion. Modernized equipment, a larger work area, even an apartment above the garage if you're interested." Hank stared at the drawings, trying to understand the catch. Developers didn't change plans out of the goodness of their hearts. "And what do you want from me in return?" "A business arrangement," Blackwell replied smoothly. "The development will include corporate offices and a residential tower. They'll need an on-site automotive service. Your reputation in this community is excellent, Mr. Wright. It makes more sense to partner with you than to bring in someone new." It sounded reasonable, but something wasn't adding up. "So instead of being Thompson's tenant, I'd be yours." "Not exactly," Olivia interjected, leaning forward in her chair. "Dad, show him the other papers." Blackwell hesitated, then pulled out another document. "Thompson agreed to sell the garage directly to you, with financing through a small business program our foundation manages. Favorable terms, fixed interest rate. In 15 years, you'd own it outright." Hank's mouth went dry. Ownership had always been a distant dream, something he'd given up hope for years ago. "I can't afford. The monthly payment would be comparable to your current rent," Blackwell interrupted. "Slightly higher, but with the expanded facilities, you could increase your client base. And as I mentioned, we'd contract your services for all company vehicles in the region." Hank's mind raced, looking for the trap, the hidden clause that would reveal this was too good to be true. "Why?" he finally asked, looking between father and daughter. "Why offer this to me?" Blackwell's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Discomfort, perhaps, or even a hint of shame. "The original plan has been reconsidered. This approach proves more advantageous for all parties." "Dad," Olivia said, a note of exasperation in her voice. To Hank, she explained, "After what happened when I stayed with you, seeing how you live, how you and Pete take care of each other, I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen when our development came through. I asked my father to look for alternatives, and you found one that happens to benefit me," Hank said, still skeptical. "It benefits everyone," Blackwell insisted. "The community keeps a trusted business, we gain a reliable service partner, and yes, you get stability and eventual ownership. Business doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, Mr. Wright." Before Hank could respond, Pete appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a shop rag just as his father had done earlier. "Mrs. Grimes's car is fixed," he announced, then paused, sensing the tension in the small office. "Everything okay, Dad?" Hank looked at his son, the boy who helped with breakfast and worried about college scholarships at 14, who stood ready to defend his father against men in expensive suits. Then he looked back at the documents on his desk. The architectural drawings showing a modern garage with his name on it. The financing plan that would turn him from a tenant with an uncertain future to a property owner. "Mr. Blackwell is offering us a chance to buy the garage," Hank explained, watching Pete's eyes widen in surprise. "For real? We could own it." The hope in Pete's voice made Hank's chest tighten. "It's a serious offer," Hank acknowledged, turning back to Blackwell. "But I'd need to review these documents carefully. Have my own lawyer look them over." "Of course," Blackwell agreed, seeming relieved by the response. "Take whatever time you need. My contact information is in the folder." As they prepared to leave, Olivia lingered behind while her father stepped outside to take a phone call. "I wanted to thank you again," she said quietly, "for helping me that night, and to apologize for how my father behaved." Hank shrugged. "Water under the bridge. Not to me," she insisted. "That night changed something for me. Seeing how you and Pete live, it's not about how much stuff you have, is it? It's about connection, taking care of each other." Hank felt a smile tug at his lips despite himself. "That's what family should be." Olivia nodded, glancing toward the door where her father stood talking on his phone. "Isolate. Even in proximity. I'm learning that. We both are, I think." After the Blackwells had driven away, Pete turned to his father, eyes still wide with excitement. "Are we really going to own the garage, Dad?" Hank looked around at the worn but familiar space, the tools organized just as he liked them, the walls covered with calendars and reminder notes, the ancient radio that still somehow picked up the baseball games. For 7 years he'd poured his sweat and skill into this place, never knowing if any given month might be his last. "If the paperwork checks out," he said cautiously. "It looks that way." But why would Mr. Blackwell offer this? He didn't seem like the generous type when he came to our apartment. Hank thought about Olivia's words, about connection and taking care of each other. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes people can surprise you. Even people like Robert Blackwell. What he didn't say was that he recognized something in the way Blackwell looked at his daughter, a man realizing that all his wealth and power meant little if he lost the connection to the one person who mattered most. Perhaps this unusual business offer was as much about a father trying to bridge the gap with his daughter as it was about a development project. As Pete helped him close up the garage for the night, Hank found himself looking at the familiar space with new eyes, not as a temporary workplace that could vanish with one landlord's decision, but as the foundation of a future they could build together, father and son. For the first time in years, that future looked not just possible, but promising. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Hank pulled the tarp off his latest project, a classic 1967 Mustang that needed nearly everything replaced. 6 months had passed since his unexpected meeting with Robert Blackwell, and the world around him had transformed almost as dramatically as the neighborhood. Construction crews worked steadily on the buildings surrounding the garage, the skeleton of Blackwell's development taking shape against the skyline. The constant noise of hammers, drills, and heavy equipment had become the soundtrack to Hank's days. But unlike the other local business owners who had been forced to relocate, Hank's garage remained standing, not just intact, but improved. The new sign above the entrance read, Wright Automotive and Repair in bold letters, with established 2018 beneath it. The date wasn't when Hank had first started working at the garage, but when he had signed the ownership papers, making the business truly his. Some days he still couldn't quite believe it. Dad, Pete called from inside. The parts for the Henderson job just arrived. Hank gave the Mustang an affectionate pat before heading back into the garage. The interior space had doubled in size, with 2 new hydraulic lifts, a computerized diagnostic system, and a small waiting area for customers complete with comfortable chairs and a coffee machine. The concrete floor still showed stains from years of oil and grease, but they were partly covered now by rubber mats that made standing all day easier on Hank's back. Pete was unloading boxes from the delivery truck, his frame having stretched upward several inches in recent months. At 15, he was shooting up like a weed, already nearly as tall as his father. Basketball season had started again, and college scouts were beginning to take notice of his skills on the court. Mr. Blackwell called while you were out back, Pete said, as Hank helped him carry the parts to the workbench. Said he needs the company SUV serviced before some big conference next week. Hank nodded, making a mental note to add it to the schedule. The service contract with Blackwell Development had been as good as promised. A steady stream of vehicles that kept the garage busy even as construction disrupted regular customer access. Also, Pete added, a hint of excitement breaking through his attempt to sound casual, Olivia asked if we're still on for dinner Friday. The dinners had become something of a monthly tradition since the deal was finalized, the Blackwells and the Wrights sharing a meal, alternating between restaurants chosen by Robert and home-cooked affairs at Hank's new apartment above the garage. The arrangement had started awkwardly, with Robert clearly uncomfortable in Hank's world and Hank equally out of place in the upscale establishments Robert preferred. But over time, something like friendship had developed between the 4 of them. Tell her we're looking forward to it, Hank replied, unpacking a set of brake calipers, and remind her that it's her turn to bring dessert. The garage door opened again and Lloyd Thompson walked in, looking tanned and relaxed in casual clothes that had replaced his usual coveralls. Since selling the property and moving to Florida, he returned every few months to visit old friends and check in on his former business. Place is looking good, Hank, he said, glancing around approvingly. Better than I ever managed to make it, that's for sure. That's because Dad doesn't spend all his money on fishing gear, Pete teased, having heard plenty of stories about Lloyd's expensive hobby. Lloyd laughed, not bothering to deny it. Speaking of which, caught a marlin last week that would make your eyes pop. Got pictures if you want to see. While Lloyd pulled out his phone to show Pete his fishing triumph, Hank found himself reflecting on how strangely life had unfolded. A year ago, he'd been worrying about making rent, stretching every dollar and wondering how he'd ever afford to send Pete to college. Now he owned the garage, lived in a comfortable apartment upstairs, and Pete's college fund was growing steadily thanks to both the increased business income and a scholarship program that Robert had quietly suggested Pete apply for, all because a teenage girl had missed her bus on a rainy night. "Earth to Hank," Lloyd said, waving a hand in front of his face. "You still with us?" I asked if that fancy new diagnostic system was worth the money. "Every penny," Hank confirmed, pushing aside his musings. "Cuts troubleshooting time in half on newer models." They chatted for a while longer before Lloyd headed out to meet other friends, promising to bring back a fresh catch when he returned in the spring. As the afternoon wore on, Hank found himself watching the clock more often than usual. At 4, he told Pete to close up shop while he showered and changed upstairs, though Friday's dinner was still days away. Today's meeting with Robert had been scheduled for weeks, and it wasn't one Hank wanted to be late for. The apartment above the garage had once been a storage space, now converted into a comfortable 2-bedroom home with an open kitchen and living area. The renovation had been part of the deal with Blackwell Development, but Hank and Pete had done much of the interior work themselves, giving the space a personal touch that reflected their tastes: simple, practical, but with small indulgences like the large television for watching sports and the kitchen island, where they still took turns making breakfast. Freshly showered and dressed in one of his few button-down shirts, Hank grabbed the folder containing the papers he'd need for the meeting. As he headed out, he paused to straighten a framed photo on the wall, himself and Pete standing proudly in front of the garage on the day the new sign was installed, both beaming at the camera. Beside it hung a newer edition, the 4 of them, Hank, Pete, Olivia, and Robert, at Pete's championship basketball game last season, where Robert had surprised everyone by showing up wearing a team cap and cheering as loudly as Hank when Pete scored the winning basket. The drive to Blackwell Development's downtown office took 20 minutes, the gleaming glass tower a stark contrast to Hank's practical workspace. The receptionist greeted him by name. He'd been here often enough now to be recognized, and directed him to the elevator. Robert was waiting in the conference room, sleeves rolled up and tie loosened, looking more approachable than he had in their first encounters. Spread across the table were architectural drawings, financial projections, and legal documents. "Hank," he said, extending his hand. "Thanks for coming in. Coffee?" "Please," Hank replied, setting down his own folder as he took a seat. The view from the conference room windows showcased the entire city, including the neighborhood where his garage stood, now partially transformed by new construction. Robert poured 2 cups from the carafe on the sideboard, sliding one across to Hank without asking how he took it. After 6 months of regular meetings, Robert knew Hank drank his coffee black. "I've been looking over the new projections," Robert began, pulling out a spreadsheet. "Phase 1 is ahead of schedule and under budget. The commercial spaces are already 80% leased." Hank nodded, having witnessed the progress firsthand. "The area's changed faster than anyone expected." "Which brings us to our discussion," Robert continued. "Phase 2 is set to begin next quarter. The board has approved the expansion to include a technical training center, focusing on automotive and mechanical skills." This was news to Hank. "A training center? Like a vocational school?" "Similar, yes. More specialized, with direct pathways to employment." Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. "We need someone to develop the curriculum and eventually run the program. Someone who knows the industry inside and out, who has practical experience and can teach others." Hank set down his coffee cup slowly as the implication became clear. "You're offering me the position." "I'm asking you to consider it," Robert corrected. "You'd maintain ownership of your garage, of course. This would be an additional role with appropriate compensation." Hank's mind raced through the possibilities. "I'm not a teacher, Robert. I've never done anything like that." "Neither had I when I started my company," Robert replied. "But you've taught Pete everything he knows about cars, and he's already better than most mechanics I've met. You have a gift for explanation, for breaking down complex processes into manageable steps." The compliment caught Hank off guard. "I'd need to think about it." "Talk to Pete." "Of course," Robert agreed. "But there's something else." He paused, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. "The training program would include a scholarship fund for promising students. The board has approved naming it after Pete." Hank stared at him in surprise. "After Pete? Why?" Robert's gaze shifted to the window toward the neighborhood they had both in different ways helped to reshape. "Olivia's idea, actually. She pointed out that if Pete hadn't been so focused on finding scholarships for college, She might never have stayed with you that night. The chain of events that led to our partnership might never have happened. There was something in Robert's voice, a rare vulnerability that reminded Hank that beneath the tailored suits and business acumen was a father trying, sometimes awkwardly, to connect with his daughter. "She's proud of you, you know," Hank said quietly. "For changing the development plan. For finding a better way forward." Robert nodded, a fleeting smile crossing his face. "She's taught me as much as I've taught her, maybe more." He straightened, professional demeanor returning. "In any case, the proposal is on the table. Take some time to consider it." As Hank drove home later, the city lights began to twinkle in the early evening darkness. He thought about the meeting, about the unexpected offer, about how a single decision on a rainy night to help a stranded teenager had rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated. The garage came into view, the new sign illuminated by spotlights, the apartment windows above glowing warmly with the lights Pete had left on for him. Beyond it, construction continued on the development that had once threatened his livelihood and now promised new opportunities. Life rarely followed a straight path, Hank reflected as he parked his truck. Sometimes the most important turns were the ones you never saw coming, like opening your door to a stranger on a stormy night, not knowing she would change everything. Or realizing that a man you once thought of as an enemy might become something like family. Pete was waiting upstairs. Homework spread across the kitchen island, a pot of chili simmering on the stove, his turn to cook. He looked up as Hank entered, curiosity written across his face. "So, what did Mr. Blackwell want?" Hank hung his keys on the hook by the door, smiling at his son. "He made me an interesting offer. Let's talk about it over dinner. There's something I want your opinion on." And as they sat down to share their meal and their thoughts, as they had done countless times before, Hank knew with certainty that whatever came next, the foundation they had built together would stand strong, much like the garage below them, weathered but resilient, ready for whatever the future might bring.